Hi everyone, and welcome to Core Lecture 2. Today, we'll be discussing rhetoric and rhetorical situations. Before we begin, you'll need the following materials for today's lecture assignment. You'll need access to the Project 1 Rhetorical Analysis assignment sheet, and you'll also need access to your weekly homework document because we will be doing writing throughout today's lecture. The purpose and goals for today's lecture are as follows. We'll explore common understandings of the terms rhetoric and rhetorical situation. We'll investigate the connections among rhetoric, writing, and community engagement. And we'll define the terms logos, pathos, and ethos. Now, before we can get into the nitty-gritty of what a rhetorical situation is and what rhetoric really is, we first want to define the term itself. So, what is rhetoric? Rhetoric is a term that we hear thrown around quite a bit, especially today. Most commonly, rhetoric is associated with persuasion, and in fact, one of the most succinct definitions that I've come across defines rhetoric simply as the art of persuasion. Now, if we want to expand that a bit, we could say that it is using the available means of communication to induce your audience to action. So, if you're the speaker in a certain situation, you have an idea that you want to convince others is either worthy of action or worthy for them to adopt. So you will say, okay, well, if I want to convince this audience, this specific group of people to either perform this action or to value this mindset or this kind of idea that I find important, what kind of word choice would best fit for this audience? What kind of examples should I use? What kind of facts and statistics would be most appropriate? Who should I cite? And even today, what's really great is that we can even expand our considerations with how we present that rhetoric. So, do I make a video? Do I put together a website? Do I create a brochure? Do I write an academic article? So it's thinking about the different things that go into persuading someone to do something and selecting the best means of communication in that sense for your identified audience. When rhetoric is tied to persuasion, it's commonly also associated with Aristotle, and we're actually going to look at that in greater detail here in just a bit. Now, Aristotle really laid the foundation for how we understand communication, writing, and persuasion even today. So he wrote on rhetoric thousands of years ago, but we're still having these robust conversations about how we can unpack or analyze certain texts using Aristotle's framework. Now that we've defined rhetoric essentially as the art of persuasion, we want to think about the context in which rhetoric occurs. And we can look at that, I think, best through the idea of rhetorical situations. So, as you go through, once you've selected the artifact that you want to write on and analyze for the project one, you want to give careful thought to what the specific rhetorical situation is for that piece. Okay, well, what's a rhetorical situation? Again, like rhetoric, there are a few definitions out there, but this one by Lloyd Bitzer really gets at it, and that is a rhetorical situation is the environment in which a writer or speaker creates rhetorical discourse. When we think about a rhetorical situation, there are three components that really allow us to understand what's going on that led the speaker to choose the available means of communication that they did to persuade their audience. So those three components are purpose, audience, and constraints. Now that we have defined the term rhetorical situation and rhetoric, We might be wondering, okay, well, what does that mean for rhetoric? The presence of a rhetorical situation, or even the idea of a rhetorical situation. First and foremost, the presence of a rhetorical situation implies that rhetoric is context based, meaning that how I try to persuade one individual isn't going to necessarily work out for another individual. Anyone who's tried to convince their parents of something, you probably had a different approach for trying to persuade mom than you did for trying to persuade dad. And so that is a good example of how rhetoric is really context based, because maybe you wouldn't use the same examples or the same type of appeals when trying to convince mom to let you do something as you would dad. As a result, the appeals will change based on the available means of persuasion. So, going back to that earlier example, let's say you want to go see a movie with your friends. If you want to convince your mom, perhaps you say, I'm going to learn so much from this movie. It is jam packed with educational, historical bits of knowledge, and I'm just going to really walk away a smarter person. And maybe with dad, you find yourself saying, there are a lot of really cool action scenes. I'll tell you about all the car chases. Yeah, it's a cool historical movie, but there's other stuff going on, and I'll fill you in later. So, obviously, your approach for one would not work for the other. And so we can see that with each different situation, the types of examples, the types of language that we use, and even the types of platforms that we use can change. It also implies that not all rhetorical approaches are considered equal. So there isn't this just standard, this persuasive technique will work for everyone. So for example, let's say I want to go to that movie with my friends and I say to my mom, it's so action packed. I will let you know about the car chases. It's going to be awesome. That is not created equal, and that is not an equally viable approach for mom as it might be for dad. And so you always want to be aware of the different components of a rhetorical situation to see, okay, is this the most appropriate for the purpose and the audience? Now, if we shift gears and we really think about it in terms of what that means for the speaker or the individual trying to persuade an audience of something, this puts the onus on them that they must be aware of several factors before creating a persuasive message. So, for example, if you are holding an event for a certain audience, perhaps circulating your message on social media is far more effective than using print flyers or passing out a pamphlet. So you need to be aware of who's your audience. How are they accessing your message? What kind of examples are they best going to engage with? What kind of language resonates with them regarding the topic that you are speaking or writing on? So while we are going to be looking at this more from an analysis-based perspective for project one, this is important to keep in mind as we move throughout the semester, especially as we get to project four, where you are going to be making your own argument and trying to convince an audience. Turn to those three components for defining a rhetorical situation. Those components, remember, are purpose, audience, and constraints. On the surface, these are rather broad terms, so there are certain questions we can ask ourselves that will help us better understand each component to effectively and thoughtfully define whatever environment, whatever situation this specific instance of rhetoric is occurring in. So the first thing we want to consider is purpose, and we can ask ourselves the question, why is the writer writing? Another way to think about this question is, what is the writer writing in response to? So, for example, let's say you are walking to class and you pick up a copy of the Dixie Sun. Someone writes an opinion piece talking about how textbooks cost too much. Maybe the reason this person is writing is to encourage the bookstore to lower prices, or to negotiate with publishers for lower prices. And maybe they're writing in response to the fact that for one course, their textbooks cost $300 or $400. So, with the purpose defined, so why is the writer writing? Not just the argument they're making. If they're making the argument for lower cost of textbooks, we do want to understand why. So not just the argument they're making, but why they're making the argument. Now, once we've defined that, we can move on to audience. And that's when we want to ask ourselves, who is the writer trying to persuade? Who is the writer trying to call to action here? So perhaps in that previous example, maybe they are trying to persuade bookstore employees. Maybe they're trying to persuade other students to get involved in this conversation. Maybe they are trying to persuade publishers to lower their overall costs that they sell the books to the bookstore for. So we want to think, who is the writer trying to persuade? Defining audience can be a bit tricky, and we'll explore this in much greater detail throughout the rest of the semester, but it's important to note audience will fluctuate. Audience size and the specificity will vary from one situation to the next. Sometimes audiences are very specific. So maybe there is a writer who is writing in response to noise at the dorms. They are trying to persuade those who live in the dorms at Dixie State University. They don't care about students who live in dorms in other places, but they are really trying to engage that specific audience because those are the individuals who are impacted. Other times, audience can be very broad and extremely diverse. So if you are proposing a law that might get enacted on the national level or the federal level, then that means all of those individuals in the dorms are your audience, but so are all other Americans at that point. So we can see how audience can be very specific or it can be very broad. And oftentimes that does circle back to the purpose. Finally, we want to consider the constraints that are often associated with the audience. Now, when we think about trying to persuade someone, like I had mentioned earlier with the I want to go see a movie, but my approach to asking mom is radically different than my approach for trying to persuade dad, we can see those as examples of constraints in action. So we think what beliefs, accepted facts, traditions, interests, social or political factors might influence or limit a writer's text. So for example, if I'm trying to convince mom, I know that she believes that if we go to the movies, we need to learn and we need to take something away from it in one way, shape, or form. I know that with dad, he believes and values that movies should be fun and entertaining. And so both of those constraints placed upon the speaker would dictate to say, okay, well, mom's held beliefs are that movies are less entertainment and more educational. So I'm going to value the education on this one. And I'm not going to play up the whole, oh, it's action packed, it's great. But with dad, maybe if I'm trying to convince him, my constraint is, okay, I know he values more of the entertainment and less of sort of the, oh, we go to learn. And so my constraint is I downplay, the whole, oh, yes, there are many historical facts presented in this movie. And I say, hey, great dialogue, super action packed scenes. It's going to be super entertaining. It's going to be great. And so we can see this, of course, play out in several different ways based off of who the audience is. So if you are speaking to an audience that holds a certain religious ideology or value, you want to make sure as the speaker that your message is respectful to that. If you are speaking to an audience that leans one way or another politically, you want to make sure that the examples that you're citing and the approaches that you're suggesting align with that political ideology. And so these are examples of constraints that we want to be aware of, because if I find myself saying, okay, well, I want to talk about how great basketball is and how much fun it is to watch. Well, if I'm speaking to people in Southern California, I probably would cite examples of the Lakers and the Clippers playing. But if I wanted to make that argument to, say, someone in Utah, I might cite examples of the Utah Jazz playing. So even though I'm trying to make the same argument, I have different constraints placed upon me that are going to influence what I say and how I say it. Again, even though the argument is essentially the same, that basketball is fun to watch. Now let's take a look at your lecture assignment. Review the 4 available artifacts on the Project 1 assignment description. Select one rhetorical situation consideration, so purpose, audience, or constraints, and briefly answer the associated questions regarding that artifact. So come back here, maybe you, depending on which one you want to look at, answer the question for one artifact. Why is the writer writing, and what are they writing in response to? Or for the one that you selected, you could say, who is the writer trying to persuade? You could define that audience. Or for the artifact you selected, you could say, okay, well, what constraints, what beliefs, accepted facts, traditions, interests, social, political factors might limit or influence a writer's text. So answer the questions that are associated with one of these components, either purpose, audience, or constraints. Now, this doesn't have to be terribly lengthy. About 30 words should do it. Okay, now that we have defined a rhetorical situation and we have stressed that rhetoric is context-based, let's start to investigate what goes into rhetoric. For this course, we are going to greatly focus in on Aristotelian rhetoric. So with Aristotle, he is known as the granddaddy of rhetoric. Any major rhetorician, a lot of writing textbooks, they all come back and they cite Aristotle in one way, shape, or form. The reason being, he was really the first person to conceptualize rhetoric and to basically put words to what the ancient Greeks were already doing, so he could teach his students to be well prepared for the public forums once they entered them later on in life. In his work on rhetoric, he suggested that successful rhetoric includes 3 components: an appeal to logic, an appeal to emotion, and appeal to authority. The first that we want to look at is logos, or the appeal to logic. Logos has a number of different applications, but easiest way I think to look at it is often connected to the use of facts and numbers. As you can see here, I see it very much as the Spock appeal. So for example, I might provide a logos-based argument that reads, Leonard Nimoy is the most successful member of the original Star Trek cast because he appeared in the original series and 8 franchise films. So someone else could make an argument to say, no, it's William Shatner, or no, it's this person or that person or whoever. So someone else could certainly challenge that argument. But I am using a logos-based or a logic-based appeal to say, hey, numbers-wise, no one compares to Leonard Nimoy. He is the person who has done it all, and as a result, he is the most successful member of the original cast. So the next that we want to look at, pathos, which is the appeal to emotion. This one, pathos, I think, is the easiest to determine and to identify when you are analyzing a text rhetorically, and I think it is often the easiest to tap in to when you are in the speaker or writer role. To help us better understand how emotion can play out, Aristotle proposes 2 overarching categories: happiness and anger. So when we think about happiness, oftentimes emotions that are associated with that would be hope, acceptance, joy, patriotism, pride, love, things of that sort. Whereas with anger, perhaps sadness, fear, panic, anxiousness, frustration, isolation. So going back to our example of the textbooks, let's say the purpose for writing, this writer is writing a piece about how textbooks are too expensive in response to the fact that they are, one course costs $300-400, right? Well, if the intended audience is fellow students, to get them engaged, rather than saying happiness, like, oh joy, I just spent almost a month's worth of rent on my textbooks for one class. Maybe happiness is not the appropriate emotion to tap into if you're trying to convince your fellow students. Perhaps anger is the way to go, frustration, or anxiousness, or sadness. I'm not, and basically say you should be mad because books cost this much, they cost a ton of money, we're poor college students, everyone should be outraged about this. And so the emotions that we appeal to are going to be greatly dictated by our defined audience. And in fact, we can see that as a way that constraints play in. So, again, if you are writing to fellow students, you can communicate an emotion similar to outrage or frustration. If you're writing to the bookstore or to the publisher or to the administration, you could use fear or anxiousness to say, listen, I just dropped $300-400 on this book or these books for this course, and I'm out until my next payday. How am I supposed to make ends meet? So you can see how, even though we're kind of going under the same umbrella of anger, the specific emotion that we're tapping into does change based upon our audience and their understanding and accepted beliefs regarding the topic we're writing on and the argument that we're making. The final one is ethos, or appeal to authority. Now, what's really fascinating is that On Rhetoric, Aristotle makes the argument that essentially ethos should be driving the bus. Your authority should be the most important component of persuading someone. However, that's not the case. Much research has been done to show that it is very much pathos, or the appeal to emotion, that drives the rhetorical bus. But Aristotle's rationale for this was, if someone is not trusted by their audience, then the audience, they could have the best statistics, they could have the best facts, the organization could be on point, the imagery, the language, the emotional appeal, everything could be perfect. But if the audience does not trust the person standing in front of them, those perfect approaches will mean nothing. Now, ethos can manifest in a couple different ways, and that depends heavily on who the speaker is, especially in the context of the audience they're speaking to. So let's say I'm in church and I'm just a general member of the congregation, right? So if I'm listening to someone speak, the speaker, I could see first the speaker, him or herself, holding credibility. So if I'm, a member of church, I'm sitting in the congregation, among the congregation, a priest is seen as authoritative on religious doctrine because of their title and line of work. So if I'm listening to a preacher, a priest, or a bishop speak, I'm going to say to myself, okay, this individual has had years of training. This is something that is their life's work, their life's passion. I am going to trust them that when they tell me this information, that it is accurate and that it is correct and it is conveyed in an ethical way. So that is the speaker themselves holding credibility for their audience. Now, much in academic writing, the speaker will introduce major minds in the field, and you'll see this in action, especially in projects 3 and 4. So if we go back to the church example, a teenager is speaking to a congregation and quotes the priest. So let's say I'm sitting in the same congregation, but instead of listening to the preach, I'm listening to this teenager. And in my mind, I'm saying, okay, well, yeah, they're bringing up good points, but they haven't really studied this as extensively as the priest has, or perhaps as extensively as other members of the congregation, or maybe they don't have the life experience, or maybe they haven't, this isn't their life's work. And so I don't view them as the person conveying the words as authoritative in and of themselves. But as soon as I hear that teenager say, oh, and according to our priest, I know that they've done their homework. I know that they know how to correctly quote and use the words of the priest to make their case or to make their point. So, like I said, in academic writing, the second one is far more common than the first, and we think of that in terms of citation. So, whatever kind of research or paper that you're writing, or argument paper that you're writing, you're going to be citing sources to basically say, yeah, I'm still a developing expert in this, but here's what the other major minds in the field and those who hold credibility themselves are saying, and that proves to the audience I've done my homework and I know what I'm doing. So please view my argument as credible, even if you don't recognize me as credible quite yet. All right, so for the lecture assignment, here's what I would like you to do. I'd like you to return back to the assignment description for Project 1 and again review the 4 available artifacts. Now, what you'll need to do is select one of the appeals, logos, pathos, or ethos, and briefly discuss how each of the artifacts attempts to meet that appeal. And your discussion for each artifact should be approximately 30 words. So you basically would say, okay, I want to look at how each artifact is using logos. And it can be very informal to say, artifact 1 uses logos in this way. Or we can see how artifact 1 attempts to appeal to pathos in this way, or ethos in that way. So pick one, logos, pathos, or ethos, and see how that one appeal is used in each one of the available artifacts. Okay, so for the weekly homework, you'll need to include the Core Lecture 2 summary and assignment in your Week 1 homework submission. Overall, your Week 1 homework submission should include the following. The Core Lecture 1 summary, for Core Lecture 2, the summary and the assignment, and a summary and assignment for a mini lecture of your choosing. All of that is due to the assignment submission folder on Canvas by 11:59 p.m. on Sunday, August 25th. If you have any questions or if there are any concepts that you want to chat about, please feel free to message me on Canvas DM. All right, everyone, until next time.